And we've had to film this over a couple of different days, so that's why you can see that there's been a drastic change in the weather, a big contrast, and also how I'm dressed as well. Now on the first Ordnance Survey map of 1865, this is actually shown as Barhaugh Pit, and it shows there's a lime kiln between here and the Barhaugh Estate. And this is Scarberry. This part of the estate was known as Scarberry, so the drift got the name of Scarberry Drift. And when Mr. Dryden took over the hall, he didn't reopen it, he took over the hall, this is where he came and started. He started here actually mining, and in Blackclough. But he was here in Blackclough around about 1909, 1910. And this drift dates from then. It already had old workings here, as we know, and the plans actually show some of the old pillars and the shapes of them. Now the drift worked on quite happily until Windy Hall, which is just situated across there, they got the idea that Mr. Dryden was pinching their coal. So a court case ensued, and the results of that court case were that he was taking Windy Hall coal without paying any royalties. And then, I bet they had such a right laugh, they found out that the Barhaugh Estate actually owned the mineral rights for Windy Hall. But just to keep neighbourly things in being, the drift was closed. Now, the drift closed around about 1914, but by which time he was really getting going over at Blackclough and setting up the infrastructure over there. Now Mr. Dryden came up here in 1909 to this lonely spot up at the top of Blackclough. We can see how isolated the place is, and he started driving Blackclough Drift. Now a man by the name of Roland Edward Beavis moved up from the south of England in 1912 to Kirkhope, and he joined Mr. Dryden in the venture, and together they became managing directors of the Barhaugh Anthracite and Minerals Company. Now to get the coal away from the Blackclough Drift, they constructed an aerial flight, and it was in two stages. The first went from the railway near Slaggyford to the loading station in Blackclough itself, right down in the valley. Now that was constructed with steel standards, but this section between Blackclough Drift down to the loading station, well, this was constructed during the First World War and they couldn't get the metal, so this was of wood. Now the lower section was just a single cable, 3 inches, that's what the aerial flight run on, but this was the bi-rope system because of the incline that they had down, and it dropped about 150 feet between here and the loading station. The incline was such that a loaded skip going down could bring up an empty, but they kept the engine in gear just in case of overspeeds and so forth. Now the whole thing was powered by a gas engine that came from an old brickworks down in Gosforth. We can still see the remains of the loading station, and there is actually photographs of it. The loading station, the gas producing engine, but they're in the Harry Beavis collection that's at Wartime Colliery. And I don't know if we can still get access to that, although I did take some sneaky photocopies during the 1990s when the collection was up at Gosforth Records Office. Where the terminus of the upper aerial flight was, and we're on the pit top at Blackclough, pit heap, and the main drift actually went in here, and there's some air shafts up on the top as well. Everything run quite well for the first year or so when the aerial flight was up and running. The bloke who was in charge up here, who run all the underground operations, was a guy by the name of Jack Snowden. He was the deputy and his sons helped. One big problem they did have at the start, when they set the aerial flight actually in motion, Harry Beavis was the son of Roland, then at school, and he was on holidays. And that was when they had the first trial run. Now Harry was up here more or less on his own, the signal box, where for the aerial flight, and Mr. Dryden and Jack Snowden were right down in the valley, down where the loading station is, and as you can see there's certainly no line of sight. So when the first skip arrived up here, sadly the clutch plate didn't work properly, and the skip got caught between the plate and the wheel, and before young Harry could get to it to knock the stop signal, to knock the power off, it smashed the wheel in bits, I'm afraid. And with it being wartime at that period, there was all sorts of red tape, and they couldn't well, they couldn't get a replacement wheel for quite a long time, so they had to stack the coal up here. It carried on till about 1916, when sadly they hit a fault, That was the end of that really. They tried hand boring to try and find the coal again. They even sunk a shaft at the drift head, well, at the end of the drift, to try and find coal, and they couldn't. So what they did, they came along then and drove another drift on the other side of the field there to the east, and that worked along till that also hit the same fault basically. So that looked like the end. During wartime as well, they were struggling getting men anyway. Quite a few men came from all over, some from Nenthead, and basically on a nice summer's day, many of the guys that were available were farmers as well. So rather than be at the pit, and it was a nice summer's day, they were haymaking, looking after their own interests, which you can't blame them. So consequently, they weren't working any coal, so there was no revenue made. Not only that, the pit then started to lose money because the railway company started charging Mr. Dryden, because they were leaving empty wagons. There was no hoppers down by the railway where the Ariel flight delivered. The railway company would come and leave a couple of wagons there for them to fill, because it obviously took them a while to fill a wagon of coal. So they were having wagons left, and there was nobody at the pit working the pit. So the railway company were charging the coal company. So again, more and more losses. The government started a scheme that benefited them in a way that they could prospect. So they explored the old lead mine drift to see if they could find the lay of the land, but they weren't really experienced enough. So sadly, that was the end of the Black Clough drift. And what they did, for a while they turned their attention right back up to Horseman's Ford again, where we've already been and where they were in the 1830s. But that was unsuccessful. Going all the way up on the fell up there was no proper way of getting the coal away. It was boggy, they had to pump every day, and it failed pretty quickly. As you see, it's an isolated place, isn't it? So that was basically it for the time being, until they started the middle pasture and also the Julie drift. So the company did keep going. It had a bit of an afterlife, as we can see. Terminus of the Ariel flight, and a long way down to the valley bottom, no line of sight, and down across Barhaugh Park. You get the idea of a bit of the isolation of the place. The more the day goes on, the more and more respect I'm getting from Mr. Dryden. We're up now at the Julie drift that he drove in the 1920s, around about 1920 to 1926. This is into the Firestone coal, or if we're in the true coal measures, it's known as the oakwood, but in the anthracite measures it's called the Firestone, because it's near that sandstone level that made a lot of fire lintels out of, Visy sandstone. And how they got coal away from here, I just don't know. There's supposed to be a tramway. I'm looking down the fell to see where it was. I can make a bit of something out, but I can't make a lot out. Now, one thing about the Julie drift, apart from its location and the fact that it was into a different coal seam, was it introduced a new family into the area. The line of the drift running in behind me here, like I said, it brought a new family to the area, which was the Shepherd family. Now, I'm sure when I worked for Frank, he said that his dad Stan came to work here. I know he came to work at this Barhaugh, but I'm sure he said he worked at the Julie drift for a start as well. And then when Barhaugh finished, he went working for Frank Heads at what was then Ale Whiteley's, and then from there he went working at when they opened the other Ale Colliery, and Stan carried on there, and the Shepherds are still mining there. It's the last working coal mine in England. So this was the actual drift up at Julie into the Firestone seam. Now, I'll just give you a shot down the hillside, and if you can spot the tramway, you're better than me. That's the line of the drift. See the drift's falling in there, coming just below the pit heap. And that's where it seems to go there. You see Black Clough Farm in the bottom. So the loading station is round about there. But there's not much sign left in the field, if there was anything. But that's obviously where the tramway's gone. You can see the isolation of the spot. And we'll look across to where Black Clough drift was there. And you see what I mean about that's there actually, Black Clough, that's it. You can see what I mean about Mr. Dryden. He just didn't give up. And these aren't small obstacles. He's not just moving further down the road. And we sweep back up to the fell where he went into the Fell Top coal there, the Clough coal, you know. This looks like where the bit of a cutting where the tramway went down. Tell you what, who needs Alton Towers? Just jump on a full and going down there, eh? But there doesn't seem to be hardly any signs in the meadow. You see the line of the drift, and it looks like that's been the return drift there. This is the site of the loading station. There's still quite a few bits and bats left, as you can see. The drift from the middle pasture came across the big black burn there on a bridge and up onto the top floor. Don't know what that is left, whether that's one of the actual metal standards from the Ariel flight, I don't know. So there is pictures of this and of the gas engine. Came down from Blackclough Drift, out of sight. Just up there we can see the Julie Drift that was driven in the 1920s after Blackclough had closed, and apparently there was a tramway connected the two. Now the gas producing engine was 25 cylinder and it ran off all the slack coal which produced the gas, and young Harry Beavis on his holidays from school, well, his job was to start it, which obviously he really enjoyed. He'd light the fire in the producer, then he'd turn the handle on the blower for about half an hour or so until the gas came off. Then two men would turn the engine with the flywheels to suck it in and compress the charge. Harry would then trip the magneto at the right instant on the firing stroke. Then once going, the engine needed very little attention. And the aerial flight itself ran then down across Barhaugh Park. You can still see some of the concrete foundations in Barhaugh Park. It ran for a mile down to the railway station. It was just a single rope on this, 3-inch rope, and then there was a long span across the River South Tyne. It's fantastic to still see this here, isn't it? And Blackclough, just checking my notes again, it did run until 1918, bit time they messed about with the different faults and one thing and another when they call it a day. And just up there, right at the top, we can see Horseman's Ford, the very far trees. That's where the Fell Top coal crops out. That's it from the front. Some interesting buildings there as well. I don't know if they're to do with the farm, because the farm's just across the ford. Well, to all intents and purposes, it looks like a kiln. I suppose it's quite obvious, really, isn't it? There's the loading station, the offices and everything else there, and they've had a kiln here, haven't they? Here we have the bothy from the lead mine that Dryden did up so that some of his men could stay. It was very rarely used. You can't blame them for wanting to get home, can you, really? The bothy, the loading station is just there, and this is the old Barhaugh lead mine. I know back in '95 we had a NAMO meet here and some of the lads went up, and I've got a photograph of Nick Catford coming out of there. When we call it a lead mine, I don't know if it produced lead or just produced stones. In the 1850s it said a reputable company who were working it. It hit an underground spring eventually, so I don't know if it actually produced anything. That's where Mr. Dryden wandered up to see if he could ascertain the lay of the land. These are the remains of the middle pasture drift. The drift actually went in down here. A bit of a fall into it here as well. And just behind. Tramway went across to the Blackclough drifts originally, and down to the loading station, and later on a tramway took the coal right down to the road to Williamston Bridge down there. If we look on the fell, on the opposite side of the fell, it's sadly hid in the trees. Just in those trees there is Shawfield, and on the census it shows lead miners living in Shawfield in the 1850s, 1860s, and they were probably to do with the lead mine that was driven down in Black Clough Burn there. We're going to have a look at that on the... Well, we've had a look at that already, but that's where they lived up on Shawfield. Other lead miners lived up on Slaggiford Fell End, and a lead smelter lived in Knaresdale village itself. But you can see, it looks like they're getting water out of here now. It's been purified. And I know when Frank reopened Barhaugh Drift, which is just round the corner, there was talk of disturbing the water supply for Barhaugh Hall. Well, this is all that's left of Middle Pasture. Dryden had opened up the Middle Pasture Drift in 1920, and then it seemed to come under the tenancy of a bloke called Henry Burt. Now, to get the coal away, they originally put a tramway across to the Black Clough Drift behind us, and for a start they were hand putting across there. And then they decided, well obviously that was hard work anyway, wasn't it? So they then put an incline down to the loading station, a self-acting incline. Now at some point the pit fell in the hands of Barhaugh Minerals Limited. Now I don't know whether that's because one company went bankrupt and they started up again. I honestly don't really know. And when they worked it, they actually put an incline down the hill here, and it came towards the junction where you go into Black Clough Farm on the Barhaugh Road, and they put some screens and bunkers there, and then the coal went away by road. But basically Middle Pasture Drift carried on till 1936, when the coal thinned down to about a foot thick, and they gave up. You know, obviously there was a depression in the 1930s as well. But the coal has a tendency to thin out round here. At Frank's also at Barhaugh, it went down to a foot at times, and even at the best of days it barely got to about 18 inch. So that was really the end then of Barhaugh, 1936, when they finished at Barhaugh Minerals, until the 1950s when the Curras took over, and they reopened next door to the Scorbary Drift. We can see the original tramway they took across for hand putting across to the Black Clough Drift. And looking down here we can see the road that went down to the loading station. Black Clough Farm's just in the trees. There's not much remaining of the line. I'm taking that to be part, this here to be part of it. The incline they put down to where the road is. But we're going to look right back all the way up to Horseman's Ford. And Julie Drift is right up on the fell. So you can see it was a big wide ranging place. Nothing was close to each other, was it? And then obviously, you know, the aerial flight right down across Barhaugh Park. There's more of the tramway from between Middle Clough and Black Clough. That building there, I'm not sure what that is. There's a heap here as well. I don't know about being hard work coming across here. It would have been miserable most of the year, let alone hard work, laborious. And it's slightly uphill and all. Imagine coming across here, the howling winds and the wind driving at you, and the freezing cold winters. What are you doing today? I'd sooner go down pit than go on that again. Well, I've waited nearly 28 years to actually make the journey up here, since I saw plans of Barhaugh Estate. And we're up now near Horseman's Ford. There's two waterfalls marked on the map. There's one and there's the other, and up here is the location of the pit that's shown on that first Barhaugh plan in 1830, and I have to say it's quite an inhospitable place for it to get to say the least. Well, we're between the two waterfalls, three waterfalls actually. It looks like we're in the lower Fell Top Limestone. And I must admit I am struggling to find this pit. I hope it's not a wasted journey. Well, we've kind of come to the boundary of the old Barhaugh Estate, and stood where I presume Horseman's Ford was, which is here. And the wall you can see, well, that has to be the estate boundary. And I'm sure, thinking back to the plan, which is sitting on Simon Danby's table, the actual shaft, the old shaft, is obviously on the Barhaugh plan. And I'm presuming where you can see that bush behind me, that's where the depression is. And that looks like the favourite on top of there. But we're going to have to kind of leave it at that. Maybe I could look at the plan and come back someday. But it's not one of those places you really want to come back to. It's been hard work getting here. It's a lovely spot, quite an isolated spot. and I don't know how on earth they got the coal away from here. All I can say is to them, good luck to them. They deserved everything they got in a good way. Well, I've stumbled on an old shaft. Rather than look for it, is it the one that's on the map? Seems to be in the wrong place. We have a gully going down there. Horseman's Ford there. Down where the trees are down there into the burn and the gully. So is it an air shaft? We'll find something a bit further down. Well, we was looking for Dryden's workings up in the Fell Top, the coal clough coal as well, and this does look like the most likely place. It's dead overgrown now, and like the report said, boggy everywhere. There's a boundary wall down there where we think we found the old drift down, and the Horseman's Ford, and the map does show at the top of a gully some old coal workings, and this is where we're at. You can see bits of drifts, certainly look like they've been drifts in. And further up here as well. According to the Ordnance Survey, there's also another coal shaft up on the hill somewhere. It's not easy finding your way around here. But these certainly been coal drifts in. I can't say for sure this is where Dryden was at. But they're certainly marked on the map as old coal workings anyway, and there is definitely drifts here. If Dryden wasn't here, he was somewhere close by. And like I say, he didn't half stick in after the coal. I was thinking too about the drift down by Horseman's Ford, being so isolated, and then as we came up the burn, up the black burn, through the through the Fell Top stone, really, the Fell Top limestone. They've probably been burning lime up there, without again looking at the plan of the estate to see if there's a kiln up there. But certainly somebody had been on with something. You could see they made a little bit of a building, so perhaps they didn't take the coal off the fell altogether. Sad really, after all the effort that Dryden had put in and all the hopes, and he'd gone through some difficult periods, hadn't it, economically, through the 1930s especially. Chances of boom years during the First World War, but geological problems kind of denied him of that. But I think you've got to give it to Mr. Dryden and the people that work for him and work with him that tried to make this a success. And we're going to wind our way back now towards Barhaugh, where he lived that way, and look where the Curras went in the 1950s.